Good afternoon. My name is Ronald Volkmer. I'm a retired law professor from Creighton University School of Law in Omaha. And on behalf of the 8th Circuit Historical Society, we are conducting an interview today of the Honorable John Gerrard. It's my great pleasure to be the interviewer for this session, and I thank John Gerrard for appearing with us today. This is a special event. This commemorates Judge Gerrard's elevation to senior status for the United States District Court for the District of Nebraska. This is a project of the 8th Circuit Historical Society in which various judges have been interviewed, and we are just so pleased today to have Judge Gerrard joining us for this session. So, Judge, thank you very much. And
it's always a pleasure to be with you, Professor Volkmer. You know that.
We had a pre-session, and so we hope that we can convey to the audience the kind of background picture of your career and expanding it to beyond just simply your role as a judge in the United States District Court, because I found your experiences here in Nebraska in the judicial branch of government and even before that in private practice to be very interesting and fascinating. So, Judge Gerrard, let's start by talking about, like myself, you're a native Nebraskan, and I believe your native land is the area around Schuyler, Nebraska. Is that correct?
That is correct. I was born and raised in Schuyler. In fact, I was the second baby born in Schuyler Memorial Hospital. I was born November 2 of 1953, and Schuyler Memorial Hospital was opened November 1 of 1953. So if you want to know how old Schuyler Hospital is, you can always convey it through me. But yeah, I was born and raised in Schuyler. My dad was a veteran of World War II. He lost his leg in World War II in November of 1944. I probably would have been raised on a farm, but Dad lost his leg and he came back. And he was a significant member of the Schuyler community. He was the clerk of the draft board back in the days when we had a draft. Right. And so anybody that was 18 years old knew who my father was. So some thought a great deal of him, others did not. And so he did that half-time, and then he was also a justice of the peace in Schuyler, but he wasn't a trained lawyer. But he was a justice of the peace, again, back in the days when we had justices of the peace. And you recall in 1972 when county judges became official state employee county judges, and we no longer had justices of the peace after that. So that's what my dad did, and my mom was a nurse at Schuyler Memorial Hospital. She was the director of nursing for many, many years there. So she saw a lot of babies come through Schuyler, and so my dad's name was Mel and my mom's name was Eileen. But I had a great upbringing. Had two older sisters, Mary and Ann, and an older brother, Bill. And Bill actually was in the same class as Chief Justice Mike Hevigan.
Really?
They graduated in 1965 from Schuyler High School together. But that's probably more than you want to know. But I grew up in Schuyler.
There's aspects of that, Judge, that I wasn't aware of when we did our pre-interview. Yeah. And do you have any recollections about your dad's role as Justice of the Peace, or were you too young to even contemplate that?
Oh no, I was fairly. The Justice of the Peace would handle primarily speeding tickets, every once in a while drunk driving or reckless driving. So I wanted to stay out of my dad's courtroom. But it was interesting, as with many justices of the peace, he had a little office that was across the street from the Last Chance Bar, and so oftentimes my mother would end up going. He did marriages, okay, and many of those marriages, the young women were 7 or 8 months pregnant at that time, and so they were shotgun weddings.
Did they have any in the Last Chance Bar?
They didn't have any Last Chance Bar. They'd go over to the Justice of the Peace office, but my mother was the maid of honor, oftentimes at a shotgun wedding. I remember that, and I also remember my dad just thought the world of the Nebraska State Patrol, and the officers there thought highly of him. But now that I've become a judge, I look back at those times and I'm thinking I'm not sure that every defendant got a totally fair shot in the justice of peace system, because Dad thought a lot of the Nebraska State Patrol, and I'm not sure he would have ever ruled against them.
Well, back in the day, Judge, there were justices of the peace who were not lawyers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so that kind of strikes us as a little bit odd today, but that was then.
And yet it was an interesting system, because I say that with the State Patrol somewhat kidding. Dad was a very fair man, and people thought he was, and they thought of him as judge. And in many ways, that system is not totally unlike our jury system. I mean, Dad heard the cases from a common sense point of view, and his judgments were fair and thought of as fair. And so I still think we have the right system now, having county judges and district judges, et cetera, but the justice of the peace system did work, and it was a fair system for back in the 1950s and 1960s.
I think to me it has kind of reverberations today in the small claims court.
Yes, it does. Yes.
Kind of the people's court.
Yes.
So
very much so.
People did that out of a spirit of willingness to serve. It wasn't exactly something which.
Yeah, it was not a high-paying job.
No.
Let's put it that way.
So your dad and mom were more or less prominent in the Schuyler community, and John, switching over to your education, I assume you went to the public schools in Schuyler, Nebraska?
I did. I graduated from Schuyler Central High School in 1972, and had a good experience all the way through high school. Back in those days, you could participate in everything. I played football, basketball, track, baseball. Would be in plays and productions. In fact, when I was in 5th grade, I was Kurt as a 5th grader in Sound of Music. And so, the point being, I was in band, I was in theater, I was in jazz band as well as athletics, and back then Schuyler had a good basketball team. Everybody remembers the Jolly Green Giants. Everybody remembers Chuck Gerrard in 1968 and Gene Harmon in 1970. And of course, I played with Gene Harmon. I was a sophomore when he was a senior. And when I was a senior in high school, I averaged about 19 points a game at Schuyler Central High School. But I noticed in the years since then, nobody ever says, "Did you know John Gerrard played basketball at Schuyler?" You knew Chuck Gerrard did. You knew Gene Harmon did. But anyway, we had a great experience in high school.
Well, I had a similar experience in a small Nebraska high school where you got to participate in all those activities, and I really think that makes for well-rounded education at that level and broadens your experiences in preparation for whatever.
It does.
Wherever your career path.
And I think in some of the smaller communities in Nebraska that still happens. Unfortunately, at the Class A and Class B level, if you're in basketball or soccer or whatever it is, that's volleyball, that's a year-round venture now, and I'm not sure we have quite the same well-roundedness, but my kids somehow survived it just very well.
So you have a decision about going to college, and so I'd be interested in hearing how you eventually ended up at Nebraska Wesleyan University here in Lincoln.
Yeah, well, that's kind of an interesting story, because Schuyler is only 60 miles from Lincoln, but there had not been a Schuyler graduate go to Nebraska Wesleyan for I don't know how many years. It was a significant number of years before that, and I had an assistant basketball coach that had graduated from Wesleyan. He wanted me to take a look at that and got a hold of the basketball coach, and so I ended up getting recruited by Nebraska Wesleyan and a couple of other places. But when I went down to Lincoln and Nebraska Wesleyan, I just really enjoyed everything about the school. It was the right size. I had the opportunity to play basketball and do different things there, and I kind of wanted to be away from my old Schuyler buddies at that time, which turned out to be a good decision. But many of them went to Midland or to University of Nebraska, and I was kind of the only one that went to Nebraska Wesleyan. And then after that, there were a number of Schuyler kids that went to Nebraska Wesleyan in the 2 years and 3 years.
So you set the precedent.
I don't know that I set a precedent, but I brought some along, and had a great experience at Wesleyan. Not unlike Creighton, the professors really got to know you. I mean, they cared about you. I remember when I applied to law school a number of years later, and I came back and asked for recommendations. There would be a Bill Cassini or a Glenn Bush, who were my professors and advisors. I mean, they knew me right away by first name, and not only did they not provide, obviously, letters of recommendation, but just solid guidance. And they knew me not just as a student, but as a friend. And Wesleyan was a great experience for me. And as a result of that, I've stayed very connected to the Wesleyan community. I served on the Board of Governors for a number of years, 9 years back in just a few years ago, and I was chair of the Board of Governors, and so I was very involved in Nebraska Wesleyan, and still am. They gave me a lot in life, and I want to give back to them a little bit.
So now let's turn to the topic of basically your academic major and your decision as you go into your third and fourth years. You have to make a decision about career choice and what you're going to major in, and so those are pretty important decisions, obviously. And so I'll be curious to hear about how you settled upon what you did settle upon.
Yeah, well, it was an interesting evolution. My mother wanted me to be a doctor. Okay, she wanted me to be a physician, and she had eyes on nothing else. And so my first year and a half at Nebraska Wesleyan, I took all science classes, and as with many lawyers, organic chemistry separated me out in calculus in my sophomore year. But actually, by the time I got to be a junior and senior, I really focused on, I wanted to be a probation officer. I mean, that was the career that I wanted to seek. I was not thinking about being a lawyer. That wasn't even on the screen whatsoever. And so I majored in sociology, minored in psychology at Nebraska Wesleyan, and there was an emphasis there in corrections and political science. And so that was my major my junior and senior year. And so as I got into my senior year, I was looking at going to graduate school, and I looked at 2 or 3 different places, but the University of Arizona had a program. It was a master's in public administration, an MPA, and they had an emphasis in corrections. June Morrison was the professor, and everybody knew June Morrison out on the West Coast. And so I chose to go to graduate school right away, right after graduating from Nebraska Wesleyan. So I went to the University of Arizona and got a master's in public administration at that time. That was in 1976 and 1977.
So there you are in Tucson, Arizona, which is a little bit different than Schuyler, Nebraska.
And I was an intern with the probation office there. And I actually wanted to become a probation officer. I wanted to stay in Pima County, and there was an opening for a probation officer, and there were 37 applicants, literally. And the 2 finalists were myself and a young Hispanic woman who was very capable and spoke the Spanish language.
There you go.
So you can guess who probably got that
yes,
job. And so I then applied to be a probation officer in the state of Nebraska, and there was an opening in Norfolk, Nebraska. So in 1977, in the spring of '77, I came back and interviewed with Judge Merritt Warren and Judge Gene McFadden. They were 2 district judges in Madison County, absolutely great district judges. And I interviewed with them, and I was offered the job. So I came back to Norfolk, Nebraska, and I shouldn't say came back. It was the first time I went to Norfolk. And so that was in 1977, and I started work as a probation officer in June of 1977 in Norfolk, Nebraska.
So where does your future bride work into all of this, John?
All right, well, I met Nancy. Nancy was a nursing student at Lincoln General Hospital back in 1974. I probably shouldn't say where we met. I was a bartender, okay, at Sandy's. It was a great job, and there were 3 really good-looking nursing students who would come in on occasion to Sandy's, and so that's where I first met Nancy, and she was impressed with me because I knew so much about Watergate at that time.
Really?
Okay? That was the summer of 1974.
Right.
We all remember what happened in July and August of 1974. And so for whatever reason, she was impressed that I knew so much about that. And long story short, we started dating in September of 1974. And it wasn't a year or so later that I asked Nancy to marry me. The best decision I've ever made in my life, judicial or otherwise. And so Nancy and I got married actually when I was going to graduate school in Tucson, Arizona. So we got married in March of 1977, March 11th, in the biggest springtime blizzard Gothenburg has ever seen. It started snowing late afternoon, March 11 of 1977, and most of the people that were invited to the wedding couldn't get there, but everybody remembers our wedding day in March of 1977. So that's how Nancy entered the picture.
Wow. So I knew that she fit in there somewhere along that timeline, but that's even more interesting in terms of, again, the culminating event, the Gothenburg wedding that, as you said, no one will ever forget.
Nobody
was there.
And so Nancy became a nurse in 1975, and for anybody that's wondering how I got through graduate school or law school or otherwise, Nancy Fickinger Gerrard put me through graduate school and law school.
Well, that's often a story that we hear with law graduates, that the supporting spouse plays such a supportive role in the future career.
She was supportive in every way.
So, Judge Gerrard, you're back in Norfolk, Nebraska, which was not your native town, which was Schuyler.
Right.
And so you are embarking on a career in probation, as I understand it.
I did at that time. So that was June of 77. And as I mentioned before, Judge Merritt Warren and Judge Gene McFadden were the district judges at that time. Both great mentors, excellent judges. And unfortunately, Judge McFadden was killed in a train accident in 1979. But Judge Merritt Warren remained on the bench for a number of years. I eventually came back to Norfolk. We'll talk about that later. But Judge Warren was my mentor, was my role model, all through life. When I went on the Nebraska Supreme Court bench, when I went to the United States District Court, Judge Warren was very supportive, and he was the gold standard up there. So I was a probation officer for about a year and a half, and that was actually where I first became interested in thinking about being a lawyer. There were young lawyers in the court. I was in the courtroom often. I did both pre-sentence investigations as well as supervising probationers, and that was really a fulfilling job. It was, but I saw the other young lawyers in the courtroom. What they were doing was fascinating to me, and I thought, I could do that. I could do that, and so I took the LSAT and began looking at law schools. And long story short, I applied in the fall of '77, or actually spring of '78, and went off to law school. You'll be disappointed to know I did apply at the University of Nebraska and at Creighton, and I got into both of those, and I almost went to Creighton. And Nancy and I, for whatever reason, decided, we might still end up back out on the West Coast, and let's go to a West Coast school. We can always come back to Nebraska. Right. If we wanted to stay in the West Coast, it's probably better to go out there. And so that was really the reason for the decision. I went to McGeorge School of Law. which was in Sacramento, California. It was a school that emphasized trial practice a great deal. Certainly did at that time, and it still does. So I went to McGeorge. Now that I'm back in Nebraska, I kind of regret that I didn't go to either Creighton or University of Nebraska, but I had an excellent experience at McGeorge.
Yes, they had a reputation, as you said, for trial advocacy and that type of legal education.
So when I was there, I did, obviously I went through all of their trial advocacy programs because I knew I wanted to be a trial lawyer when I came back, and I worked at, they had what was called an Institute for Administrative Justice, which did a number of administrative hearings throughout the state. My second and third year I worked there at IAJ, and I was also heavily involved in their moot court program. I was on the moot court board and did all of that program. So I took advantage of as much as I could on both moot court and the trial practice, getting ready for that career.
So the next stage is really critical, and that has to do with which bar exam am I going to take? Where do I see myself in the practice of law? So that had to be, for you and Nancy, quite a momentous decision.
It was and it wasn't. So both Nancy and I thought we would probably stay in California the first couple, 2.5 years that I was in law school. And then in January of 1981, our first daughter, Erin, was born. And we looked at each other over the course of the next month or two and said, where are we going to raise this child? And we decided that Nebraska was the better place to raise our children, to be around grandparents, to be around cousins, to be around those types of things. And so Erin and Gerrard was a decisive factor in us coming back to Nebraska. So in the summer of 1981, I took the bar exam in the state of Nebraska.
So so you came back to Nebraska and you told me you kind of went into hibernation to study for the Nebraska bar. Is that more or less true?
I did. Back in those days, as many of the older lawyers will remember, the written portion of the exam, it was fairly well known that it was wise to study the advance sheets. Okay, yes. If you'd go back and take the last 2 or 3 years of advance sheets, and I read every advance sheet. I outlined the decisions, the cases, et cetera. So I took a bar exam course at the University of Nebraska that lasted, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. But then I went back to Gothenburg, Nebraska. Nancy was working as a nurse, and I was in her parents' basement, holed up, studying for the bar exam. And I can tell you this, as a professor in law school, when I'd take a law school exam, I never knew how I did. I mean, I thought I got some of it right, didn't get some of it right, et cetera. I just didn't have a great feeling coming out of any exam. When I took the bar exam, I knew I'd nailed it. I mean, I had prepared significantly for the bar examination and knew that I had nailed it. One other story about the bar exam. So this was on a Tuesday and Wednesday, and that Tuesday when we were taking our breaks at the bar exam, Princess Di and Prince Charles were getting married. So I can tell you they got married on July 29th of 1981 because that was when the bar exam was. And so anyway, side story, now that you know when Lady Di got married.
Right. So you're successfully passing the Nebraska bar. Now you're looking at a career here in Nebraska as a lawyer, and so I guess you kind of returned to familiar territory.
I did. I went to work for the law firm of Jewell, Ott, Gatz, Collins, and Domina. And I later learned that Judge Warren, who I've mentioned before, talked to Dan Jewell and in no uncertain terms said, you need to hire this guy. Okay, I interviewed with the Jewell firm, and I think the interview went fine, and I would like to say that I deserved all kinds of credit. I later found out that it was in Dan Jewell and everybody else's best interest that they hire John Gerrard. And so I went to work for Jewell, Ott, Gatz, Collins, and Domina. that was in 1981 for about a year, and in 1982, then the youngest partner of that firm, Dave Domina, went out on his own, and shortly after that, I joined Dave Domina in the practice of law in Norfolk. But I had a great experience at both the Jewell firm and with Dave Domina. Dave and I were together from 1982 through 1990. He eventually moved to Omaha, Nebraska, and then I went out on my own in 1990. But Dave Koppel and Doug Stratton joined Domina and myself when we were in practice from 1982 through 1990. And then in 1990, as I said, Doug Stratton and I went out on our own. Dave Patak joined us, Jane Mapes joined us, and we had our own practice until I went off to the Nebraska Supreme Court. So.
Right, and John, we talked a little bit previously about the type of law you practiced, and my recollection was a very varied practice. You had not only courtroom experience, but all kinds of, just kind of covering the gamut of types of clients and cases.
Yeah. When you practice law in a community like Norfolk or Kearney or Hastings, it's very much a general practice of law. When I first came back, it was expected, because I was a probation officer, that I was going to do criminal law, and so about 20 or 25% of my practice was criminal law. That was just very much expected, and I really enjoyed doing it. And so I had a great amount of experience in criminal law. I represented a number of first-degree murder cases up there, to all the way down to DUIs, to defending the clergy. There were all kinds of stories I've got about criminal cases. But so about 20 or 25% of my practice was criminal law, and I did a lot of that, trial practice. The other two other portions of my practice, I did a significant amount of personal injury work, so civil trial work. And I did anything from product liability cases to personal injury to wrongful death, and those were really very fulfilling. I think back, I did a case against Ford Motor Company. It was a Bronco rollover case. We were one of the initial Bronco rollover cases, and I associated with counsel in both South Dakota and in Texas, and we got a significant settlement in that case. But that's where I really learned where large companies can put you through the gamut in discovery. Well, let me tell you, we went through the gamut, but that was a significant case. I had wrongful death cases anywhere from mid-air air collisions to when you go to a Target store and they have the little marked crosswalks with a stop sign. That was because of a case I had in Norfolk, Nebraska. Unfortunately, I represented a client in a wrongful death case that was run over coming out of a Target store. And we received a significant verdict in that particular case, but it wasn't 2 or 3 months later that Target and other stores like that had the crosswalks and had the stop signs after that. So if anybody's coming out of a Target store and sees a stop sign, you can think of Judge Gerrard. Okay. But anyway, so I had a number of cases that were like that. And the most fulfilling part of that is I still get calls from clients. I'm just last week I had a call from a brain injury client that, and he calls at least twice a year just to catch up with me, and there's just a lot of gratitude going both ways in a case like that. After I became a judge, I've done a number of marriages from friends and family and all kinds of things, but two of the more interesting marriages I did, one of them was the son of the victim that was in the Bronco rollover case. I did his wedding because I stayed close to that family. One of the murder defendants that I talked about, ended up with a second-degree murder once we entered the plea. He was down at the Nebraska State Penitentiary and eventually got out. But while he was in the state penitentiary, I did his wedding. And so I've done weddings in all kinds of settings, let me tell you.
Well, Judge Gerrard, that's, I think, very enlightening for us, that when we look at a lawyer's career, we oftentimes think about, their advocacy role in courtroom, which is certainly central, but the human dynamic of what you're talking about in terms of interacting with your clients and that relationship that you form.
That's what you take away. I think it's important for any judge to have had clients, okay? I mean, to understand where they're coming from, to listen to, and when I say understand where they're coming from, they didn't come from backgrounds like you and I, okay? And so as a lawyer, it's really important to listen to that and be able to advocate for that, but as a judge, it's also important to understand that.
Well, I'm often reminded of Judge Holmes's aphorism about the life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. Yeah. And so for you to relate to us these experiences, and we're going to talk about your judicial experience, but I think it's so important in this interview to get into, those formative years that being literally in the system and interacting with clients at a personal level, and how impactful and meaningful your work with clients was. But as we talked about earlier sometime, that can take its toll in terms of the
practice law is tough. And I recognize that when I look out at lawyers who represent clients and are advocating for them. I know what they've gone through in depositions, or maybe what they've just talked to them about in the client counseling room, et cetera. They have to advocate as best they can for them, but I understand what they're going through.
Well, you've been there, done that, and I think in terms of, before you ascended at the bench, that experience in terms of the wisdom you gain, the insights you gain are just invaluable in terms of preparing you to be a judge, and it was
just very fulfilling. It really was. I still miss the practice of law. I mean, I do. It's I thoroughly enjoy being a judge, but there are often times I miss the practice in the arena.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a little more difficult question.
All right.
What about the long hours that you had to put in as a trial lawyer?
Well, those are difficult. But let me tell you, as a trial judge, you are putting in, when you're in trial, the judge puts in a significant number of hours, as well as the litigant. Now the difference is, I know I might be working on jury instructions, I might be there until 7:30 or 8 o'clock at night, working hard just as the lawyers are, but I remember the lawyers are still going at 11 o'clock and midnight and preparing clients and trying to get subpoenas in order, et cetera. And so trial judges work hard, they really do, but trial lawyers work really, really hard, and I understand that.
So, we could talk about, at this time you're raising, you and Nancy, a family, and we all want to be responsible full-time parents, and so there can be a little bit of tension in terms of how much time you can allocate in your role as a husband and as a father, and so we can't overlook, again, in terms of being kind of taking a humanistic perspective of law, that aspect of it.
Yeah, that was always a battle. I mean, it's difficult as when your primary practice is trial law. And I had other significant portions of the practice. I represented a number of school districts, and so I practiced school law and administrative law up in Norfolk, and that was probably 25-30% of my practice also. So there were school board meetings, and I was the city attorney at Battle Creek, and there were city meetings, and so there were a lot of evenings that were going, not just in trial practice, but at school boards, at city council meetings and things such as that. And so Nancy took a significant brunt of raising the children in the early years, and quite frankly, there were a lot of aspects that went into deciding whether I was going to become a judge or not. Okay, I mean, I really loved the practice of law, and I didn't want to leave it, and yet one of the aspects was I loved the law, so I could still be part of that as a judge, but I wanted to be a father to my kids. Okay, I had 4 children at home at that point in time, and my youngest son, Mitchell, was born in 1989, and it was around 94 or so. I just noticed whenever Mitchell had a scratch or a bump or anything, he ran straight to mom. I mean, all of his needs were met by mother, and I thought, I don't want it to be like that. I want to be a dad to all 4 of those kids.
Okay, so we're in the early 90s, you're in your early 40s.
Yep.
And so you've been a very successful trial lawyer, and I don't know where you kind of mentioned, that if the opportunity arose to consider a judgeship, that maybe that would be something that you would look at seriously. And so those things are somewhat fortuitous in how they a lot of people aspire to be judges, but the way the system works, sometimes it's just in some ways the luck of the draw.
It's just luck of the draw, it's timing, it's all of those things.
It's all of those things. So for your story, in terms of how you ended up in the Nebraska Supreme Court at age 41, I think our audience would be interested in how that occurred.
Yeah, well, first of all, it was late 94, early 95, there was an opening for Chief Justice. That's when Chief Justice Hastings had retired. Okay, and C. Thomas White was one of the applicants, and there were other very good applicants for Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Well, long story short, C. Thomas White was named Chief Justice of the Nebraska Supreme Court in 1995, in January of 1995, and so that created an opening. C. Thomas White was from Columbus, so up in my district, that created an opening, and quite frankly, I never considered going to the Nebraska Supreme Court. I did have aspirations to become a judge, but I always thought I'd be a trial judge. I mean, I just thought that's what it would be. And when that opening came forward, I'd received some encouragement to apply for that position. And my first thought was, yeah, right. Honestly was, but I gave it more thought, and Ben Nelson was the governor at that point in time, and I had been a supporter of Ben Nelson. And when you're a Democrat up in Madison County, you kind of stand out, okay? So Ben Nelson remembered John Gerrard. Anyway, a lot of those things came together. I applied for the position in the spring of 1995, got out of committee. There were some very good applicants at the time, Judge Hannon from the Court of Appeals, F.A. Gossett. There were others that would have been outstanding Nebraska Supreme Court judges. So I was very fortunate to come out of committee, and ultimately Governor Nelson named me as a Supreme Court justice, and I took the bench in July of 1995.
So now you're on the Nebraska Supreme Court, and in talking with other judges or other lawyers who assumed the judicial role, particularly on the Nebraska Supreme Court, you are with 6 of your colleagues, and your relationship with your lawyers changes dramatically, and your social relationships change. And so, were you kind of prepared for that? And how did this kind of play out in Lincoln, Nebraska, in 1995?
Well, I thought I was prepared for it, but you never are. Okay, I mean, the isolation, particularly at the appellate court, was significant. Now, I still had a lot of association with the Nebraska State Bar Association and with other lawyers, but it's not the same relationship anymore. My transition was probably helped because I wasn't in the same community. So Nancy and I moved from Norfolk to Lincoln, Nebraska, and so we made new friends in Lincoln, kept our old ones in Norfolk, still have them, but we made new friends in Lincoln, and my association was very much with other judges at that point in time. and a few other lawyers that were friends in Lincoln. But yeah, on an appellate court, there's a certain amount of isolation that I wasn't necessarily prepared for. But I will say this: the thing that struck me when I came on to the Nebraska Supreme Court was the immediate collegiality. I mean, here I was 41 years old. I was this young buck, and I wasn't a judge before. And so I thought, well, it's going to take a year or 2 years before they listen to anything that I have to say. And immediately in the first consultation, as the youngest judge, you're called upon. Okay, and so I gave my opinion as to the first case that we were considering in the fall, in September of 1995, and I was struck by how much each of the 7 judges' opinions were listened to and valued. I mean, right away, and that's still the same way at the Nebraska Supreme Court. Those 7 judges have a voice, and they have a voice right away, and people don't understand that. And back then, so C. Thomas White was the Chief Justice, and there were 3 judges that had significant judicial experience. Dale Farmbrook was there, Justice Caparelli, D. Nick Caparelli was there. I had great respect for them, as well as the other judges that I became very good friends with Justice Conley and Justice Wright and Lamphere and those. But soon after I took the bench, there was a controversial decision that many probably remember on the second-degree murder convictions, and the court was divided 4-3 as to whether a number of the secondary convictions should be reversed or not. I'm not going to go into the legal aspects of it, but what people don't understand is, in spite of, there were some sharp dissents. I mean, it was a 4-3 court at that point in time. On that particular issue, we were unanimous on many other issues, but the court was very collegial, very respectful to each other in all other decisions, and even those. And I think sometimes what people see, either at the Nebraska Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court level, they see the dissents or the concurrences and the language that's used, and that's why we have to be careful about the language we use. It's important. But regardless of that, the judges got along very well. We did. So it was a great court to start on. I will say that. And then things started to change. In 1998, about 3 years after I went on to the Nebraska Supreme Court, C. Thomas White retired at that time, and shortly after that, Justice Caparelli, Justice Farmbrook retired, and so there was new blood coming onto the court. Chief Justice John Hendry was named as the Chief Justice. He came over as a county court judge from Lancaster County, and then Justice Stephan came on, and Justice McCormick came on, Justice Miller-Lehrman came on, and as you start doing the numbers, Justice Conley and Justice Wright were there. Well, Ben Nelson had named all 7 members of the Supreme Court, and so that became known as the Hendry Court or the Nelson Court. And from 1998 to 2005, or I guess it was 2006 when Chief Justice Heavican came over, it was the Hendry Court, and the court really got along. We were collegial. It wasn't all 7-0 decisions, et cetera, but we came from different backgrounds. A number of private practitioners came onto the bench, and then had a unique understanding of the trial practice of law. And I think it was a good period at the Nebraska Supreme Court. Now then, in 2006, Chief Justice Heavican came on, and I have a great deal of respect for Mike. Obviously, I knew him from Schuyler, Nebraska. I've known Mike for many, many years. And one of the things that Chief Justice Heavican did when he came on, he didn't come on as a as a know-it-all or with a big fat agenda. I mean, he really learned from the rest of us. I mean, this was somebody that came from the U.S. Attorney's Office over to the Nebraska Supreme Court, and he's sitting there with 6 Ben Nelson appointees, and so he came on with a spirit of collegiality, a spirit of learning from others and really showing respect to us, and we showed respect to him. And so the transition of the court, you know, from 2006 until 2009 and 2010 actually went very smoothly. And I give Chief Justice Havigan a lot of credit for that.
Well, it's, you know, somewhat serendipitous you mentioned his name because his retirement reception is tomorrow, and I know there'll be a large outpouring of the Nebraska community to congratulate him on his splendid work as the Chief Justice.
Yeah, he did.
There was one other justice that in some ways I consider to be similar to your career, and that's the late Tom Shanahan.
Yes.
Tom Shanahan.
Yes.
And I got to know Judge Shanahan quite well. And in terms of your careers, both in terms of the Nebraska Supreme Court and later the United States District Court, they kind of paralleled each other, which I found interesting, getting to know both of you and what outstanding persons and judges they were, and how blessed Nebraska was to have yourself and Judge Shanahan on the court.
Yeah, well, to even be compared to Tom Shanahan is something that shouldn't occur. I got to know Tom when he was a United States District Court judge, and of course when he was on the Supreme Court also. I didn't get the chance to serve with him because he came over to the U.S. District Court just a year or two before I came on to the Nebraska Supreme Court. But I got to know Tom Shanahan well, and what a bright mind, fine sense of humor. I mean, Tom Shanahan, when you talk about the gold standard, he was the gold standard. But much of it was he came from private practice. He understood the practice of law. He used plain English in his opinions. Okay, I try to use plain English in my opinions, and his were spiced some, and some of mine are spiced some. But I think you want to convey what your judicial decisions are in plain English, and that you have heard both sides. No matter what your decision is, you want to be sure that both sides know that they've been heard.
Well, you know, this project that the 8th Circuit Historical Society is that we're experiencing, I think is so important to record the lives of persons like yourself and the late Judge Shanahan, who passed away, unfortunately, far too soon. So now you've been in the Nebraska Supreme Court for a few years, and as you relayed, you've kind of seen the kind of the shift that has occurred, and you have seniority now over some of the members of the court, the Nelson Court, and now I guess another opportunity arises for you to end up where we are here today in the United States District Court. So that I'd like to hear that story as well, Judge Gerrard.
Well, it's so much of life is just pure luck and serendipity. I had actually been on the Nebraska Supreme Court for about 16 and a half years when that opening came up, and I can't remember, I was around age 57 or so, and I really enjoyed my time, my relationships, and the work at the Nebraska Supreme Court. But I thought, you know, I always wanted to be a trial judge. I just did. And this was an opportunity to come over to the federal bench at that time, and I thought, I'm 57, I've got another several years of my career left. How do I want to spend it? And I thought coming over to the federal bench would be a great way to spend the rest of the time on my career, and it turned out to be an excellent decision. When I first came over, I wasn't sure. I was relearning federal law again and getting back in the saddle on the trial practice. It's turned out to be a fabulous decision, but really it was a matter of timing. So Judge Cupp was taking senior status in that would have been in December of 2010. So it was in 2011 is when the application process was, and Again, Ben Nelson was the United States Senator. He was the senior senator and the Democrat with a Democratic president. President Obama was president at that point in time, and so he had a lot of influence as to who the pick was. And I've always had a lot of respect for Senator Nelson, and he's had a lot of respect for me. And so when that opening came forward, I was his choice at that point in time, but it was very important that he wanted Senator Johans to be on board. That was back when the senators communicated and got along. Senator Johans was a former governor of the state of Nebraska, and judicial appointments were really important to him. And so Senator Johans said, I'll come over, I want to interview the judge. I know Judge Gerrard, but I want to interview him. I remember Senator Johans came over to my chambers with nobody with him, no staff, no notes. He sat in my office, and he relayed to me that he was a law clerk to Hale McCowan, another great Nebraska Supreme Court justice, but he was a law clerk to Justice McCowan before he went out to practice law in O'Neill, Nebraska. And anyway, Senator Johans just asked excellent questions. I mean, he asked what my judicial philosophy was, which is I let lawyers try their cases in my courtroom. I'll rule on the evidentiary rulings, but I'm not going to try to influence a trial. This is the lawyers that are trying the lawsuits before me. He asked me about 2 or 3 specific decisions on the Nebraska Supreme Court and that I had authored, how I arrived at it, et cetera. But there was no agenda. I mean, he wasn't going through the death penalty or abortion or some laundry list of things. He just asked me good questions that a good lawyer would ask. And we had probably 1 hour, a little more than that, conversation just like we're having. And he walked out of my chambers, and he wasn't even out of the Capitol building, and he called Ben Nelson, and he said, I'm good. So that's the way it worked.
That's the way it worked. But of course, you had to go through the gauntlet of a Senate hearing and ultimately recommend a vote by the Senate Judiciary Committee and going to the floor of the Senate. Was that a little bit trying for you?
Well, yeah, so it doesn't, my story with Ben Nelson and Senator Johans, it worked for them. It doesn't always work for all 100 senators, okay? So I went through the Senate Judiciary hearing, and there were no controversial questions. Senator Hatch was there, Senator Grassley from the opposing party. They were very respectful, asked excellent questions, et cetera. Nothing came out of that hearing in particular, and so the Senate Judiciary Committee was getting ready to vote, and at that time there was a senator by the name of Jeff Sessions that questioned whether I would uphold the death penalty or not. There was a case that we had decided, State versus Kerry Dean Moore. He was on death row, and he was scheduled to be executed during the summer of, I think it was 2010 or so. We had a decision that was coming up on another death penalty case just a month or 2 down the line on the method of execution, whether electrocution was cruel and unusual punishment. And so there was a majority of the Nebraska Supreme Court at that time that stayed the execution, didn't set it aside, just stayed the execution of Kerry Dean Moore until we made a decision on the method of execution, which I thought was a reasonable thing to do, a prudent thing to do. But anyway, Senator Sessions jumped on that and thought that I wouldn't uphold the death penalty, even though that's the law in the state of Nebraska, and that's the law in the United States courts and in the federal code. And he kind of overlooked the point that we had already had 2 or 3 executions that I voted to affirm, so I certainly do uphold the law. The State versus Moore decision was based on constitutional principles and something separate from that. But anyway, long story short, Senator Sessions opposed me, and there were a couple of other Republican senators that opposed me, but we got to the vote on the floor, and things went well. But it never does go perfectly smoothly. So I was to be considered with several other nominees in December of 2011. We were going to be confirmed at that time, and there was what's called a recess appointment of a gentleman by the name of Cordray. Was up for appointment to the Consumer Protection Agency, and President Obama would not assure the United States senators that he wouldn't make a recess appointment. And so Senator Grassley at that time stopped all nominations in December, and so then they placed my nomination as the first one to come up in January of 2012, and as fate would have it, President Obama did make the recess appointment. And so I can't remember how many, there were maybe 20 or 22 Republican senators that eventually voted against my nomination to punish President Obama for the Cordray appointment. But anyway, I did get confirmed by the United States Senate, and both Senators Nelson and Johans were very supportive.
So now you're sworn in and a member of the United States District Court and chambered here in Lincoln, and now you're a trial court judge, which I guess is getting back to kind of where you would, in your dream world maybe, is where you would kind of hope you'd end up. And so for the last few years, obviously, you've been a district court judge here in Nebraska and part of the federal judicial system. So has there been any either surprising moments or challenging moments along the way? Or I know you've had vast experience in the courtroom in a trial capacity, and you've seen judges perform their roles. So as I say, anything interesting or surprising about your experience here in the United States District Court?
Every trial is a surprise. Every trial is a surprise. You have unique stories to each trial, but they were all important to me. The thing that I wanted for the lawyers was to be clear in my decisions and consistent in my decisions. One of the things that I did before, you go to law school, you practice law, all of those things are really important. There were 2 or 3 things that I did before I ever went to law school that were also important. I worked at a meat packing plant for 2 years in Schuyler, Nebraska. I worked on the kill floor. I understood what it was to get up at 6 in the morning and do that job with other men and women that were in all kinds of different circumstances. But I worked at the packing plant. I was a bartender. I heard all kinds of stories as a bartender and learned to relate to people in many different ways. And I was a basketball referee. I officiated both high school and college basketball back in the mid-'70s. And one of the things that I learned as a basketball official is it is really important to be clear in your communications with coaches and the players and consistent in your rulings, okay? You might call them tight. You might let things go a little bit in the lane on an evening, but as long as you're consistent to both teams and the coaches and players know that that's how you're going to call them, then they can adjust to that. I took that to the bench, okay? I always wanted to be clear in my rulings, and as much as I could to be consistent if I was calling the trial tight or not. And quite frankly, I've had a lot of experience both as a trial lawyer and as a judge. I apply the rules of evidence, I hope, consistently all the way through. But as far as on leading questions and things where there's a little bit of subjectivity, I'll decide whether a trial needs to be called tight or whether they can throw their elbows a little bit, depending on who counsel is and how they're acting. Okay, and
we have judicial discretion at the trial court level,
and the lawyers learn that early on in in a trial, and I'll tell them, I'm telling you, I'm calling this one tight, and here's why. Okay, and so they understand that, and they can adjust with that. But I try to be clear. For example, the application of the sentencing guidelines. They can be applied in many different ways, and so I try to issue written opinions when the application of the guidelines are going to be utilized over and over. For example, in child pornography cases, the guidelines were excessive in many cases, and so I adjusted the guidelines for my cases in a case called United States versus Abraham, and everybody understand that was a written opinion. They knew how I was going to apply the guidelines in child pornography cases, and we've utilized that for the last several years. The lawyers know how the guidelines are going to be applied. There was another case by the name of United States versus Havel, in which there's been some dispute as to, in other words, the guidelines are applied significantly more harsh on methamphetamine cases if it's actual meth versus a meth mixture. Well, everything is actual meth anymore, okay? I mean, for the last at least 10 years or so, the testing that's been done, it's all pure crystal methamphetamine. It's 95% or more. And so sometimes judges would apply an actual meth guideline, which would increase sentences by 60 to 72 months, by 5 years to 6 years, et cetera, versus meth mixture. And so I wrote an opinion in United States versus Havel saying, I'm going to be using meth mixture, and here's why. I'm not going to go through all the reasoning, I've just told you some of it, but to be fair to all of the defendants that come before me, it's the same methamphetamine, okay, and defendant A should be sentenced the same as defendant B, if that's what the guidelines call for. So, not to get into the funkiness of the law too much, but I do try to put out opinions like Abraham or Havel or whatever the case may be, so that lawyers that come before me know how I'm going to apply the guidelines and why. So, long story short, I think it's important to be clear, to use plain English, to be consistent in your rulings, and the lawyers can agree or disagree with some of those rulings, but at least they know why.
Well, I appreciate that expression of what you might call your judicial philosophy in terms of, particularly in your role as a trial court judge. And of course, appellate court judges have a very different role, reviewing a record, et cetera. But I think, and also your references to, your outside, what I learned from your recitation about your life outside the law in terms of being a bartender or an official, in terms of what lessons you take from those experiences, and not just simply regarding them as a job or a task, right, but a way to learn and grow.
Whoever claims that those type of things don't shape you are just ignoring reality. They do shape you, and I think it's important for lawyers and litigants to understand that. They should know which judge they're practicing before.
Yes.
We might talk about that later if there's any clues to give. That would be one of the clues I would give.
Okay. Well, we are, I think, kind of drawing toward the conclusion of the interview here, and we've talked about your role as a federal district court judge. And now I want to circle a little bit back. Obviously, you've taken senior status, but you're still active in a sense as being a senior status judge, hearing cases. But you are, I guess, the pace has slowed down for you to allow you to maybe spend more time with your family these days. And you want to talk about your family a little bit more, because those little kids grew up in a hurry, right, John?
I do. And let me circle back to that in a minute. I do want to talk about, now that I'm on senior status, it does allow me some time to do different things, let's say with the Bar Association, for example. this year I'm president-elect of the Bar Association. I'll be president of the Bar Association next year, and sometimes people wonder, well, why would you do that as a senior judge? Well, one of the things that's really important to me is, and it has been throughout my career, is access to justice, okay? And that can take on many different meanings. When I was with the Nebraska Supreme Court, I was co-chair of the Minority and Justice Committee, which did significant work to allow access to justice for many different parties that didn't look like us. And so that was important to me. As president-elect of the Bar Association, it's really going to be important to me to see lawyers be employed and get out to communities where we're losing lawyers. We have legal deserts out there in the state of Nebraska, particularly in greater Nebraska, and so I'm going to be interested in looking at programs to get lawyers into those communities, offering scholarships, doing different things. There's a lot of different things that I'll be considering at the Bar Association. When I was chief judge of the United States District Court, that was during COVID, and we did, along with the other federal judges, I think an exemplary job of getting cases back to trial. It was important to us to have the courthouse open as early as possible, and we led the charge, both at the federal court and the state courts. So that's been a theme of mine: access to justice, to make sure that courthouse door is open and accessible to all economic levels, all racial levels, whatever the case may be, and that people have access to lawyers throughout the state. So that's one of the things that senior status allows you to do, is to go out and use the bully pulpit a little bit for things like that. As far as my family, I'm extremely proud of them. I've got 4 children. They're no longer children. They are young adults. I have 2 daughters, Erin and Michaela. Erin is a practicing lawyer in Washoe County in Reno, Nevada. She went to Duke Law School and is married and has 3 beautiful children. Michaela is
the cutest grandchildren ever.
Well, I've got 9 of them, so
you got
9 of them are, yeah. So those 3 are in Reno. Michaela is, and obviously Erin is married to Kenny. She's Erin Ching now. Kenny Ching is her husband. Michaela is married to Brandon Meller, and so she's Michaela Meller, and she has 4 children. Michaela is a family counselor here in Lincoln, Nebraska. I have a son, Eric Gerrard, who is also a lawyer, went to the University of San Diego, came back to Lincoln, and he is a lobbyist. He's in government relations, a lobbyist for the city of Lincoln and many other entities. And we're extremely proud of Eric, and he has 2 children. And so one is age 14 and the other is a year and a half. So I've got them from 1.5 years to age 14. I'm not sure if I told, Michaela has 4 children, so you do the math, that's 9 grandchildren, and they're all great. And then our youngest son, Mitchell, is living in Philadelphia. He's a PhD computer science. I can't tell you what he does, but he's actually married to a young lady from France, and they're going to be moving to Paris in January. He's got a postdoc over there, and she's a PhD in robotics, and so they speak English and French and math, and they're wonderful.
You and Nancy will have to visit them in Paris.
Well, I think we will be there come May of this coming year, but. Yeah, I remember there was a 60 Minutes interview with former President George H.W. Bush, and he had this fabulous resume. I mean, he was president, vice president, head of the CIA, a congressman, an ambassador to China. I mean, everything you would want on a resume. And the interviewer asked him what his greatest accomplishment was, and without hesitation he said, "My children still want to come home at Christmas." And if you were to ask me what my greatest accomplishment was, I would steal that from President Bush. Our children and grandchildren still want to come home at Christmas, or to the Oregon beach with us, or many other places, and that by far is what I will take with me eternally in life.
Well, Judge Gerrard, this has just been a very fulfilling moment for me personally to even find out more about your judicial career, your career as a lawyer, and knowing I'm very pleased to hear that you still have kind of an agenda that you're looking forward as the president-elect of the Bar Association to...
There's still gas in the tank.
Well,
okay? There's still gas in the tank.
That's just wonderful to hear, and I'm so glad that we were able to schedule this interview and record it for posterity. I think aspiring lawyers can learn a lot from your life and hopefully from this interview. You have any further words of wisdom for aspiring lawyers?
2 or 3 things. Just always be honest with the court, okay, and with your clients. You're there as a counselor, not just an advocate. But we want you to be advocates. We want you to be the best advocate that you can be. But you need to be a counselor. You need to be honest with the court. I would say always know who you're practicing before. You know, whether it's an appellate court, whether it's a trial judge, every judge has a little different proclivity, and particularly if you're in outstate Nebraska and you're appearing Beatrice one day, Hebron the next day, Lincoln the day after that, know your judges because they have very different practices, they have different sentencing patterns, etc. But just be true to yourself and work hard. We've got an excellent bar here in the state of Nebraska. We really do. I'm proud of them. They don't need much more advice from me, but that's what I would say to practicing lawyers.
Well, to conclude this interview, I'm going to repeat something that as a legal educator I would talk to students about: the design of the Constitution, the separation of powers, and how we try to form a democracy by, particularly in Justice Anthony Kennedy gave a speech at Creighton Law School that I always remembered to talk about how the safeguards are built in that. But the judicial branch of government plays an extremely important role and will continue to do so. And I would tell anyone who would listen that the judicial branch is only as meritorious or as good as the people who occupy the positions. And so I want to thank you and the other members of the judiciary, and you in particular here in Lincoln, for your amazing career, your thoughtfulness, your dedication to law, and to your family, and to being a role model, which makes me extremely proud that we have. When you talked about you're proud of the Nebraska lawyers, let me just say that the Nebraska lawyers are very proud of the Nebraska judiciary, and particularly for your service. So thank you, Judge Gerrard. It's been
it's always
a wonderful
It's a pleasure being with you, Professor Volkmer. Always is.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.